Good afternoon, Donal. Greetings from Ukraine.
Thank you.
My name is Olga Demedenko, and I'm translator. And it was honor and pleasure for me to translate your novel, The Spinning Heart, into Ukrainian for Astrolябia Publishing.
Well, thank you so much, Olga, for doing that work, because I'm sure it wasn't an easy job.
Yeah, it was. it was very a real challenge, but yes, very real interesting. And I'd hope that today we will open the world of your writing to the Ukrainian reader and get the Ukrainian people more acquainted with this story that really impressed me deeply while translating. This book is very close to the reality, to our feelings also. And in this reference, just to come closer to the book, may I ask you some questions? You've prepared. The first one, the heroes of the Spinning Heart are really different, and each of them tells his or her own story, but they are interrelated with the crisis they live through. They are like Chaucer's characters of the Canterbury Tales. Those, they are interrelated with their joinery, these are interrelated with their crisis. But how did you manage to find such characters? Did they have prototypes in the real life?
Oh, absolutely. To be honest, it was no challenge at all to find inspiration for the characters, because pretty much every character in the book has a very close corollary in real life for me, because I was pretty much living that existence as I wrote the book. You know, I wrote it kind of in the white heat of the crisis. So there was no distance between me and the characters or the events, and I was experiencing some of the difficulties that the characters experience in the book. And the vernacular language that's used is very much the language and the demotic of my own people, of the village where I was born and reared, and town where I lived for my teenage years. And so there was no real reach in that respect. I guess the biggest challenge was to try to illuminate what it might be like to be in a particular situation, and to try to differentiate, because I wanted to be a chorus of voices, but I didn't want the voices to overlap too much or to swamp each other out. I wanted everybody to have a distinct voice and a distinct experience, even though everybody had the same background, really. And many of the characters worked for the same person in the same kind of job. And so I knew there would be a kind of, there'd be a similarity between how each character speaks, but I really wanted to be distinct and to differentiate easily in the reader's mind. But I know that the book, I mean, I can't imagine how much of a challenge it must have been, Olga, to translate it, because, I mean, most of there are some characters who would be only fully understood by people who are from a very narrow geographical area in Tipperary in Ireland. So thank you so much for taking the job on.
Thank you. It was really interesting challenge for me, and it was great experience. And by the way, about the number of the heroes, why did you choose such structure of the story of the novel? The number of the heroes are 21 voices, 21 chapters. But why actually exactly 21? Is it somehow related maybe to poker or or anything else?
It really was. It's a kind of strange, obsessive superstition I have about the number 7 and multiples of 7, to be honest. So it had to be either 7 or 14 or 21 or maybe 28. And actually, I had 28 in my head at the start, and my wife said, no, that's 21 is bad enough, but 28, forget it, it's way too many. But, you know, because I wanted it to be kind of like a sample of a population of a typical Irish village, where almost every man in the village was working in the building trade, or, you know, either directly or indirectly. Because so many places like that were damaged so severely when the recession hit in Ireland. You know, and people recover. I mean, people have great resilience. But of course, lots of people were destroyed by it. But I wanted it to feel for the reader as though they had paid a visit to a village, and they had met a number of people, and they had a really good idea of how the village felt and how the people of the village expressed themselves and what kinds of problems they faced and what kinds of lives they had, without knowing too deeply, who was who or who was related to who. It's like if you visit a place for a weekend and it's a small place and you go to the local pub or hotel or bar, you'll meet some people and you'll get an idea of, who populates this place, but you won't know really who is connected to who or who's related. And actually, because I did notice when I went to do readings with the book, that people were saying, Donald, I had no idea what was going on. Yeah, I know I'd keep reading back to try to figure out who was married to who and who was whose son or daughter. And I was saying, but you didn't have to do that. But of course, you can't tell somebody how to read a book, So maybe we should have put a warning on the front. You don't have to connect to characters. It'll still work. But I can't tell you exactly. I mean, really it's just this strange superstition I have about 7 being a lucky number and trying to work in multiples of 7. And I've shaken it off, since. But at the time, it was very strong.
Okay, thank you very much. But what about criminal lines in the Spinning Heart? I counted 3 of them, actually: murder, kidnapping, and fraudulence. And father and child relations are seen almost in every story, actually, even in these criminal stories. They are different. And even the ghost murdered character talks also about his father. Actually, but if it's not too personal, what is the background of this multidimensional experience that you so deeply described in this novel?
Well, I guess no matter what, even if we claim to be completely objective and to stand apart from our narratives, we will always draw to some extent from what's within us and what has happened in our own lives. And so I guess things that you try to subvert become sublimated into your writing, and thoughts that you haven't fully consciously processed might find their way into the stories you write. And I guess there's definitely an element of that. But when it comes to the level of criminality in the book, I think it might be a product of my naivety, really, and the fact that at the time I was developing as a novelist. I still am, of course, because you always are. But I was really a beginner. I was a novice, and I was sitting down whenever I had time, and I was happily creating these monologues. And I was thinking, this is good. These voices are all ringing true, and they all feel natural to me, and they feel real. And after about 14 or 15 monologues were completed, I thought to myself, this isn't really a novel. And then I started to think about what a novel actually is. And I was thinking, well, there has to be some kind of narrative propulsion. There has to be a story here besides these people just saying, this happened to me, and this happened, and this happened. There has to be some kind of overarching narrative. And so I kind of inexpertly and awkwardly shoehorned in the story about the murder and the kidnapping and the fraud, because I felt this obligation to have a narrative hook for the book, in order. And really, I was thinking to myself, how will I sell this? How will I sell this to a publisher if it's just literally a series of voices? And so, I mean, that's part of it, because The Spinning Heart to me is a very flawed novel in lots of ways, like all art is. All art is flawed. No piece of art is perfect, but I can see that's a glaring flaw in it, that those 3 elements of the story, they kind of collide a bit. And they're maybe not handled with the finesse that I might employ now, 10 years later or 12 years later. I hope. You don't know. But I was on a very, very steep learning curve at the time. But still, I don't regret it. I still think the book came out in the best way it could come out, and I'm so glad that I wrote it the way I wrote it. And I think it's always instructive to look back at what we've done before and try to draw from it some kind of lesson for what we're doing now.
And what about how did this artistic solution arise to add a bit of peculiar mysticism, to introduce into such a very realistic text the voice of a person who has already died? And such a movement in such a realistic novel is a little confusing, unusual. So
yeah, again, I think that's definitely something that I mightn't have done if I wrote the book now. But I'm glad I did it. I think that actually, for me, it lifts the novel a little bit, and it moves it out of the kind of overwhelmingly hyper-real nature that it had, because these people are speaking for the most part in a very earthy way, in a very natural way, and I tried to use as natural a kind of system of locution as possible, so that the voices just felt genuine. And I think when it comes to the fact that a ghost speaks in the book, that probably reflects my own faith in the eternal nature of our consciousness, and maybe it's hope more than faith, really. But I do have strong belief in the afterlife, and I do believe in a consciousness that continues after death. And I do believe in the ability sometimes of people who've gone to in some way. Now, I know that Frank communicates very directly to the reader, but I was trying to just kind of frame it as Frank's eternal consciousness, or his guilt, or his soul, his guiltful, trying to atone somehow, trying to admit, God, I did wrong. I did terrible, terrible harm to my son and my wife. And I also wanted to somehow find atonement or forgiveness for Frank, because he made such terrible mistakes, but still at his very, very core was a decent person who was terribly damaged himself, and was able finally to admit how much he loved his son. And there's a moment where he looks at his grandson in his crib, and he feels powerless with love. He feels he can't formulate any speech. And I think that, for me, that's a very important moment in the novel, that what he feels in that moment goes beyond language. It went beyond words. He literally couldn't formulate his thoughts or his emotions. Because that, for me, sums up a problem with men, that I suppose is kind of endemic in, maybe especially in rural areas, where there's a kind of a very clear expectation of what a man should be, a man should do, and how a man should act. And for me, maybe that moment kind of sums up that men should be to use the cliche, the strong, silent type. And I mean, I can see that, on the one hand, Frank's actions in life seem, bad to the point of being evil. But on the other hand, he looks like a wounded, vulnerable man, who never really left his childhood. And because Bobby's mother is such a good person, she must have seen some good in Frank. Otherwise, why would she have married him? But I think I left those things kind of unspoken or unsaid. There's space there for the reader to kind of extrapolate, or to maybe continue on the story in their head. And I like that in the book myself.
And about female characters, if to continue, they are also very complex, and each of them is really emotional and deep. But which of them is closer, you feel closer to you? Well,
the character of...
Favorite character.
Yeah. I think Lily, actually, and I had a very strange experience with Lily, and this sounds like a fairy story, but I sat down one Saturday morning to write Lily's chapter, and I had a very vague idea of who Lily was and what she was going to say and how she was going to add to the story. And really, in my head, I was going to use Lily as a means of illustrating Bobby more clearly for the reader. But Lily took off. She just gained her own voice very quickly. And it really felt as though I was hearing a whisper in my ear, and this character was saying, listen now, this is my story, right? And I want you to tell it. And it was very strange, it felt as though there was a very, very strong presence in the room with me, and she was almost dictating her story to me word for word. And very strangely, it's the only chapter in the novel that there were no edits for. There were no notes from the editor. There was no change made at all. Not even a comma was changed. And I wrote it very quickly. I wrote that chapter in a matter of hours, and it's published exactly as I wrote it on that morning. I remember my editor saying, God, you must have worked really hard at that chapter, because it just seems quite pristine. We've no notes at all. I was thinking that was the easiest chapter to write and the quickest. But for that reason, but maybe because of who Lily is as well, and how she is maligned and misunderstood and marginalized, and how she's dismissed, and I've seen that happen to people be completely dismissed because of who they're perceived to be, you know. And I mean, Lily has been brave for her whole life, and she's done certain work that she's had to do, you know, and she's kept her family afloat, and she's been quite heroic. But still, she's the kind of person that people would cross the street, avoid or ignore, you know, or would just kind of put into a kind of a very narrow category and leave her there. And I really, you know, I suppose it's a fairly sad part of the book where Lily is watching her son graduate from outside because she hasn't been invited, because her son is too embarrassed to invite her to graduation. You know, and
yeah, from you, it was also one of the saddest parts of the book.
Yeah, oh, really, yeah. But the character was very important. And of course, then there's Trina, who I based largely on my own wife. So of course, Trina is a very, very important part of the book. And I really wanted Trina to have a kind of extended say at the end of the book. You know, I wanted Bobby and Trina to bookend the novel because they're the backbone of it. They're the heart of it. They're kind of, everything flowers outwards from Bobby and Trina and their relationship. And I wanted Trina to be, you know, this really strong, unwavering person who, you know, is assailed and beset by these problems, but who was just willing to stand up and stand behind Bobby. And I know, again, you know, I suppose they occupy very traditional, almost stereotype roles where Bobby is this strong leader of a man, and it seems as though Trina is kind of behind him, supporting him. But really, I mean, they're very much a unit, they're very much equals in each other's eyes, and they're both strong people, and they're, you know, and they're for me, they are, you know, two halves of a kind of a whole. Their relationship seemed to me to be this kind of, this thing that I wanted to remain pristine in the book, you know. And even when there's kind of suspicion, when suspicion falls on Bobby, Trina never believes it.
Mm-hmm. Yes. But there is one more hero, very funny, a bit strange, a bit tragic, Vasya. I didn't expect to meet a man from such an unusual region, from Khakassia, in this book. Why did you choose such an unusual character from a very unusual region?
Okay, well, the reason I chose Khakassia is because I wanted it to be a region of the world where somebody could come to Ireland and could claim to be or be presumed to be from within the EU, because there was a huge class of worker who came to Ireland, and they came to Ireland to work during the building boom, and they came from all over Europe and all over the world, and tens of thousands of people were told by employers, okay, you can work for me and I'll pay you every week, but you are going to register as being self-employed. Okay, so that obviated the need for the employer to pay, you know, social insurance and all these kinds of things, or, you know, and to have to do any paperwork. And it reduced their financial and administrative burden greatly. And it was a con. It was a con. And these people, when the boom finished, they were cast aside by these employers. Loads of them had no visas. They had no legal right to be in Ireland. And so they became this huge class of invisible people. And at one point in the book, Vasya is told, sure, you're invisible, you're nobody, you know, pretty much as a joke. Mm-hmm. And that's the case because his employer never paid social insurance, and he didn't realize, you know, and because Khakassia isn't in the EU, it's not, you know, it's southern Siberia, he would have no legal status in Ireland. And I knew loads of people like that. I encountered loads of people like Vasya, and your heart would just break for them, that these people could exist in this country and have worked to literally build this country, and then have become invisible. And have had to scrabble around for scraps, you know, and almost beg to survive. It was just horrendous. And so Vasya, for me, was just the embodiment of all of those people who were left in that terrible situation. And actually, almost unforgivably, the first draft of The Spinning Heart didn't have a person like Vasya. And Marianne Gunn O'Connor, who was the agent for my publisher, said, Donald, you absolutely have to include an Eastern European worker or someone like that in the book. And of course, I had to, but I was a little bit wary about it because of being new to the game of writing novels, and of being new to the game of representing real humans in fiction. I was thinking, you know, I have to be very careful here. I have to make sure I get this right, you know. And so I suppose I shied away from it a little bit. And then when I went at the job of creating Vasya, I give it a lot of thought, and I drew on a lot of my experience from my job. And that's another thing as well. Because I dealt with so many people like Vessia through the job I was in, I was a little bit afraid that I'd get in trouble because I still worked in that job, you know, and it was a government job, and I wasn't really supposed to be writing stories about, about what I did for a living or about what I encountered on a daily basis. But, you know, lots of elements of the book actually were drawn directly or indirectly from my work as a labour inspector. It really informed the background of the book and the mechanics of it. But I'm so glad that Vessia came out the way he did. And I hope, you know, it opens some people's eyes about that crisis. Because I remember actually being in France a few years after the Spinning Heart came out, and the French edition was being published. And a man approached me afterwards and said, you know, Donald, all that stuff you have in the book about these guys who were so-called C2 boys, these people who were, you know, were self-employed, who weren't really employed, who had no status. That never happened, you know. I said, and he said, you know, he was very serious. He goes, that never happened, Donald. I'm a developer, and my son is a developer, and I can tell you right now that never happened. And I said, this guy was trying to rewrite history. You know, I mean, it was absolute and utter denial that happened. Now, maybe he genuinely believed it didn't happen, but he was just adamant that it hadn't happened. And I mean, I know for a fact that it happened. But I think it's good that these things now are recorded, you know, even if it's fiction, you know, sometimes in fiction, truth can be revealed more easily.
Yes, and this crisis was felt also in Ukraine, and a lot of people also faced some kind of similar problems. And actually, our readers right now are just getting acquainted with this novel. But what about the readers in Ireland? What feedback did you receive from them? Maybe a most surprising one, maybe a most interesting one for you, maybe most touching one. What feedback impressed you most? Because it's a real story that is felt by real people.
Well, I always love when people say that I got it right, that it somehow resonated or chimed with their experience, that the voices seemed right, that the experiences described, you know, were the experience of so-called ordinary people, you know, so-called working class people. And I hate, you know, the declensions in the so-called class system that will have some people on a higher level than others. It's just because, I mean, we're all born equal. But they're the most gratifying responses. People say, yeah, I got it right. And, you know, the response to the book was overwhelmingly positive. I was so happy, you know, and I didn't expect it to happen. And it became quite a popular book in Ireland. But I remember, you know, but you'll always have the other side of the coin. And when there's a dissenting voice, it maybe feels louder in your ear or stays, you know, or burns more deeply into your soul. But I remember once being at a book festival, and a lady she must have queued for at least 25 minutes just to say, I hate you. And she was very sick. And I was thinking, she means she hates my book now. She doesn't hate me, but she said, no, I had to come here and say it now. I hate you. And then she walked off. And a year later, exactly, I was at the same festival and in the same place, and I saw the same lady again in the queue. But my wife also saw her, and my wife said, I don't think Donald is going to want to talk to you, to be honest. And she said, oh no, I came here last year and I told Donald I hated him. And she said, I looked back as I left and he looked really hurt. And she said, I felt really sorry afterwards. I said, why the hell? Why would she come to me and say she hated me? But, you know, I know what she hated. She hated the book. She hated the language in the book. You know, there are some very refined people who have a very serious issue with expletives and profanity. And I can see their point of view, even though I think it's ridiculous, to be honest. But I'm always amazed at how upset people can get by so-called bad language. I mean, I think the only real bad language is language that separates people, that divides people, or that diminishes people. And I think the words fuck and shit and all these words, I mean, I think they're parts of our lexicon. They're a part of our actual day-to-day language. They're words we use for very specific and sometimes very powerful reasons, you know, and they're words that have power, whether it's negative or positive. They're words that are used, and I celebrate language in all its forms, and I'll never apologize for using so-called bad language. But that seems to be, most of the complaints that I got about the book seemed to center around that, and people saying that no one speaks like that. And it made me realize, very, very keenly how divided society is, and not just here. I think it's everywhere in the world, how the so-called middle class can be so removed from the so-called working class, and how the habits and mores and lexicons of the two classes can be so different and so removed, and how people can be so astonished by the actions of people from the other so-called class, because growing up, I never saw it. I grew up in a small village and everyone seemed to be in the same boat. Everyone seemed to be kind of, engaged in a kind of happy struggle. And people seemed to be neighborly and friendly towards each other. And I couldn't see any kind of division around class. And I was always very struck by it when I grew up, as I was growing up, that there were these presumptions made about people because of where they were from or what kind of house they lived in, or who owned the house they lived in. If your house was owned by the council, you were presumed to be of a certain mindset or a certain way of living, whereas if you had a bigger private house that was detached, you were presumed to be more refined. And I just found it amazing. But I guess, it's not just me, that happens everywhere.
But are you going to continue this story? If to imagine, just to imagine, what future would these characters have? Because the story is like in the middle of their lives. There is a beginning, but we don't know what will be the end.
Yeah. Oh, I've given
future. What will be their future?
Yeah, I've thought an awful lot about this actually, and I've kind of formulated plans about how a sequel to The Spinning Heart might look and how these people's lives might have turned out. And I've discussed it with my wife a lot, and she's been discouraging me. She's been saying, no, don't do it. Not yet anyway. It's too early. I think, it's been, nearly 10 years now, so I think it's fine. So I might do it. But I think it's very easy to kind of write a sequel that somehow diminishes the original, or somehow, casts a kind of negative shadow over the original. I think you have to be very, very careful, especially when a book has touched people, and when people have, a kind of fondness for a book, you can maybe ruin their experience, because I think if somebody really likes The Spinning Heart, it's very likely that they'll read a sequel, and if the sequel doesn't, look the way they wanted to look or feel as they wanted to feel, or give them the same feeling they got the first time around, it's going to be a negative experience. But some of the characters from Spinning Heart have cropped up in different books because I wanted them to have an extended life. Bobby especially. Bobby seemed to come to life for people in a very real way. And people would say to me, Donald, how's Bobby now? And they speak of him as though he were real, And I'd be saying, oh, Bobby's grand. There's no fear of Bobby. He's fine. He's working away. And so I said, God, I better address this. I better make sure this is enshrined. And so I wrote a short story collection. And in the first story, The Passion, Bobby turns up as a character witness for a young man who's in court. And because I wanted the reader to know Bobby was okay, that Bobby turned out fine, that things were, maybe that's a bit of a spoiler now if people haven't read the book. But and the same with Jim Gilday. There's a policeman in the book, Jim Gilday. And people seemed very fond of Jim. And so Jim Gilday turns up everywhere. He turns up in short stories. He's in all my novels, Sometimes he's whole scenes to himself, and he's a character of whom I'm very fond, and a character who I suspect has been plagiarized, actually. I won't say by who, but he has been.
Okay, but what about topics described in Spinning Heart? Do they continue in your other novels? For example, father and son relations or generation gap problems, etc.
Oh, for sure. Definitely. Almost all of my stories and novels center around family dynamics and how families interact, and the effect, the sometimes terrible effect that your family and upbringing can have on how you live your life and how you see the world and how you interact, and the awful damage that we can do to people we love, and then on the other side of the coin, the huge joy that exists in the act of loving someone unconditionally, that perfect, immaculate, unmitigated love that we receive from our parents, it can be this unbelievably powerful force in our lives. And for some people, how that can go terribly wrong, you know, and how the absence of that can have such an awful effect on people. And that's definitely a theme that runs through almost all of my work, I think.
Okay, but is it possible to say that your novel is written according to some tradition, let's say? And whom of the authors do you consider to be your predecessor, or whose writing inspired you or inspires you? Who is your favorite writer, actually?
Well, you know, that genuinely, the answer to that changes almost on a weekly, sometimes daily basis, because there are so many. I mean, it's very hard to find a bad published book. You know, a book that a publisher has gone to the trouble of reading and editing and fixing and binding and printing and marketing is going to have some merit. It's very hard to find a book that is without merit. But when I was growing up, it just so happens that my parents filled the house with books. They used to buy boxes full of books. And my parents had no money. My dad drove a van and my mother worked in a betting office. And so they hadn't much spare money, but they used to buy job lots of books, I think at auctions and sales of work. And we happened to have an awful lot of mid-century American novelists in the house. And so I read a lot of Saul Bellow growing up, and I read a lot of Steinbeck and Norma Mailer. And then later on, I read people like Doris Lessing and Margaret Atwood, and later again, Anne Enright and Roddy Doyle. I loved Roddy Doyle. And in my teenage years, Stephen King was he still is now, but I read The Stand by Stephen King, and it just had this really profound effect on me because it's such a feat of storytelling. You know, it's this giant book, and it's written, you know, there are many characters. I suppose it could have been subliminally an influence on how I wrote Spinning Heart, because it's a polyphonic novel. You know, there are so many characters in the book, and they come together so cleanly and so beautifully. Far more than I do in my book, and it is at its core a book about the battle between good and evil in a very literal way. You know, there's literally God has an army in the book, and the devil has an army in the book, and the armies clash at the end. You know, and it's just huge. It's amazing because it's a book that's about people. It's about individual people. It's so humane. It's so heartfelt. It's so realistic, and still it's this huge, big, mega epic book about this war between these two mystical creatures. It's fantastic. And so that was a huge influence on me. And I guess, I mean, it's very hard to find a book or a poem that you'll read that doesn't have an influence. You know, I read poetry obsessively in my younger years and still do, because I think poetry can have such profoundly instructive effect on a prose writer, you know, when it comes to compression and economy, and just, you know, bringing the last drop of beauty from a sentence. Poetry will always be inspirational. So really, everyone I've ever read is a ridiculously broad answer.
But who of the Irish authors, maybe?
Well, I remember reading John McGahern's novel. God, imagine that the name is completely out from my mind. Anyway, John McGahern sent me. That They May Face the Rising Sun was a book. It came out late in his career, and it was it seemed so simple, basically. And every sentence seemed so clean, and the sentences seemed almost preordained, as though they always existed. And they just happened to have been put into this book now, you know, and made flesh. Amongst Women, that's the one that, for some reason, the name, a book that totally influenced me as a writer, and the title just eluded me. But Amongst Women just is so sublime. And I remember encountering a description in that book of a hedgerow and how the hedgerow looked in winter light. And this short passage of description just seemed so perfect that I thought there's no point in anybody else ever trying to describe how a hedgerow looks in winter in Ireland, because now it's done. It's done in this absolutely perfect, exquisite way, you know, and that's a terribly reductive and kind of limiting way to think as a writer, because you want to make sure that every experience and every element of existence is open to you to write about. But I actually allowed John McGahern's brilliance to rob me of confidence. So I was thinking, this is just so perfectly done. This story, the story of this family is so well done. It's done in such perfect terms that there's no point trying to write about, an Irish family, whether it's functional or dysfunctional or somewhere in between, because now it's done. This book exists. But I learned to live with McGahern and just to love his books for what they are, and to draw inspiration from them instead of terror, because your heroes can inspire terror in you. You can say to yourself, that's done so well, that's done so beautifully. There's no point in me even trying. And there are more writers than McGahern when it comes to that. Annan Wright, there's a writer called Christine Dwyer-Hickey, who wrote a novel, Tatty, that just seems perfect as well. And also The Cold Eye of Heaven is one of her novels. And it was very, very underrated, I think. It should have been a huge, huge novel. And I mean, it is for lots of people. It's just so brilliantly done. She just takes Ireland and Irish society through the eyes of one man and the life of one man. And it's inverted. So we begin at the moment of his death and work back to his early life. And it's just so beautifully done. But you have to, I think you have to write your heroes out. You have to pay tribute to your heroes, and you have to eventually strike your own note completely. But you'll always draw on what's gone before, for sure. I think Kurt Vonnegut said, it takes 5 years to write your heroes out of your own writing. And my friend Julian Goff, who's a great novelist, reckons 15 years.
Oh.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Great. Actually, what your novel would you recommend to translate next into Ukrainian?
Oh.
Why not?
Well, I know, I shouldn't say that I have a favorite, because my wife loves my first novel. The first novel I wrote is called The Thing About December. It was published after The Spinning Heart, but I wrote it before The Spinning Heart. And because I wrote it for my wife, and I wrote it just to impress her, I never thought it would be published. I wanted her to believe that I actually was capable of writing a book. But because she loved it so much, and because she loves the main character so much, it's got a very special place in my heart. And it's a very straightforward novel. It's a fairly simple story of a very simple, innocent human being who is kind of like, a cork in stormy seas, who's just thrown about by circumstance, and has no real control over his own destiny. It's a very sad book, but it's quite funny and it's touching, and it's a book that came directly from my heart. There was no artifice at all. I didn't want to make any artistic expression. I didn't want to say this is who I am as a writer. This is my art. For me, it was very, very. I wanted there to be no gap between the story and the reader. I wanted the story to look for the reader exactly as I pictured it in my head. So it's very, very real. And it's a novel that really, that cost me a bit to write, because it was quite hard going at times. But I suppose it's a novel of which I'm very proud. It's I think a novel that a lot of people take to their hearts.
Was it already translated into other languages? Maybe Spinning Heart also. Where are they translated in other languages?
Well, The Spinning Heart is translated in, I think, 23 or 24 languages. And The Thing About December is maybe 15 or 16 at this stage. I should really keep a close account of these things. But I don't. Actually, just yesterday, my sister said, "You live an artist's life. You don't think about things that are practical at all." And I think she's been a bit unfair, but she's right in lots of ways. Lots of things go right over my head that I should be focusing on. But and I should have a list, of course, of all the translations, and I should have a copy of all my translations, but I don't. And I'm looking forward to actually having a Ukrainian edition in my hands.
You haven't?
Oh, maybe, it might have come in the post in recent days. I have to check. I've been kind of confined to my office because I've been editing. So, my sister's right.
Actually, I will show it to you.
Beautiful, beautiful.
I've heard it. Yeah, how do you like it?
Oh, it's gorgeous, really gorgeous. Yeah, I love that image. Yeah, because it's one of the few editions that has an actual symbol of a heart that's spinning. I love the pink and the red and the white background. Lovely.
Okay, so next question. if you like the cover. Actually, we in our team discussed a lot the title, how to translate the title, because Spinning Heart, we had several options and variants, and actually there were much more thoughts about this, why it is exactly Spinning Heart. We all may suppose, we, the readers, the translator, the editor, all of us. But what did you exactly see in it? And in general, actually, we, the Ukrainians, we call ourselves Kurdocentric, because the concept of the heart is related to the notions of spirituality, soulfulness, morality in our culture. And what about the Irish people? What does the Irishman, you, the Irishman, think or feel first when you hear the word heart, or when you think of heart? That's
lovely, actually. That's a beautiful way of encapsulating the whole concept of the heart, and tying it in with those elements of existence. It's gorgeous. But I think very often actually heart is used as a euphemism or a symbol of courage and strength. And maybe it shouldn't be, maybe we should soften our idea of what the heart is. But we all grew up, this was a mostly Catholic country for all of us growing up. And almost every house would have had some kind of image of the Sacred Heart, of the heart of Jesus, or of our Lord with the heart in his hand, literally a bleeding heart that was broken and pierced. And I think for a lot of people, that was an image that inspired guilt. It was kind of saying, look what you've done with your sins. You've broken this heart. This heart was pierced for you. This blood was shed for you. And so there was almost an element of fear about it, I think. But the image of the spinning heart that exists in the text of the novel is a metal heart on a gate that spins around in the wind. And I have a very clear memory of seeing a gate like that in a cottage by the lake near where I grew up. That kind of became for me in my head the house of Frank Mahan, that cottage. And I'm sure I saw a metal heart that spun, but I've been told since that it'd be very, very hard to make a metal heart that would be light enough, first of all, to spin in the wind. And also that wouldn't rust up every second day, because we live basically in a rainforest here in Ireland. It's a temperate rainforest, so it rains nearly all the time. And so you'd have to have a can of oil in your hand every single day, spraying this heart for it to spin at all. And so the heart itself actually is physically impossible. But maybe, I suppose, on a deeper level, the symbol evoked for me just the speed and the extent to which our image of ourselves changed in Ireland twice in the space of about 10 years. Because first of all, we had this notion of prosperity and wealth that was predicated on a house of cards, really. And when the house of cards fell, we spun back again to our old way of seeing ourselves, of being a little bit embarrassed and almost apologetic and being kind of hat in hand, and we had new overlords. We'd been colonized for almost 1,000 years. We'd been free for 80 years. And all of a sudden, we weren't free anymore. We were colonized by our financial overlords in the EU and the IMF. They were coming back to take over our country, it seemed, and we were being recolonized. And so we spun back to our own way, our old apologetic, head down kind of way of thinking for the most part. And I know that's a gross generalization about a whole nation, but that's the way it seemed. We seemed to feel embarrassed about the whole thing. We'd spent money we didn't have. We'd convinced ourselves we were financially and economically the greatest nation on earth. And in loads of ways, we have claimed to being the greatest nation. As every nation has its claims on greatness. But we just, we spun one way and back the other way in the space of a decade, so violently, so completely, that the spinning heart just seemed like an apt image. And maybe almost even too much on the nose, maybe too obvious. But anyway, it seemed like basically a nice title for the book.
Yes, it does. And actually...
What's it called actually, Olga? Is it spinning heart in Ukrainian?
Серце на шарнірі.
Oh.
Also, we tried to find the notion that is spinning.
Oh, lovely.
And actually, our countries have much in common in history, people, absolutely, attitudes, soul, and even how we withstand the crisis, our humor, etc.
Oh, absolutely, and I've always found that actually with Ukrainian people, and I mean, you know, the fact that we're both, you know, partially annexed by a neighboring superpower. I mean, we've got so much in common, and you know, I think we've had very similar struggles as a people, Ireland and Ukraine, and you know, we should be best buddies, really, as nations.
Yes. And what would you recommend to the Ukrainian readers? Because a lot of young people will read this novel, I'm sure. And you raise the topics of generation gap, and and a lot of older generation representatives also will read this novel. So, what would you recommend to the Ukrainian readers?
As regards Irish books, is it? Well, there are so many fantastic books coming out of Ireland at the moment. Anything by John Vine is going to be good. He's just got this sublime ability to write about anything and to do whatever he wants as a writer. It's incredible. Sally Rooney, of course, is a huge household name now around the world, and her books are fantastic. You know, because she just captured something about this generation, the so-called millennial generation. I think Sally just captured it so completely and so well. What will I see now? A book actually that I love that came out recently is called Ghost in the Throat by a writer called Doireann Ní Ghríofa. It's non-fiction, but it's about her experience of translating an epic poem about that written by a widow about her dead husband. And it becomes this thing where Doireann, you know, describes her own life and motherhood and womanhood, and it's fantastic. What let's see now. What else is coming out at the moment? That's fantastic. God, there's so much. Again, I after have drawn a blank completely. Elaine Feeney's another great writer. Feeney. Anything by Roddy Doyle. Roddy is one of my great heroes, and his books, you know, are so funny and profound. And actually, one of my favorite books is a book called A Star Called Henry, because it's a book about it's on the face of it a book about the 1916 Rising, but it's presented through the experience of a young volunteer called Henry Smart, and it becomes this book about Ireland and how Ireland freed itself and then fractured itself, you know, and then, you know, became divided, and how we substituted a colonial overlord for a religious overlord, and it's so well done, and it's so engaging. I remember reading it; I could not put it down, and it came out about 18 years ago or 17 years ago, but it's as relevant now as it was in that moment, or as it would have been 100 years ago. So everything Roddy writes is worth reading. But take your pick. I mean, you know, if you just Google Irish literature, I mean, and it's not just Ireland, of course, you know, I mean, there are great books being written everywhere. But if you are interested in Irish writing, this is a very fertile time, I think, because there are just so many books coming out. And I think that small independent presses are taking such great risks, you know, and are being so supported at the moment, that voices are being heard now that mightn't have been heard 10 years ago.
Actually, what about wishes to ask to Ukrainians, not only the books, but in general? We all suffered from the crisis. We all had a lot